Section 7 of the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin. Chapter 4, Means of Expression in Animals, Part 1. The emission of sounds, vocal sounds, sounds otherwise produced, erection of the dermal appendages, hair, feathers, etc., under the emotions of anger and terror, the drawing back of the ears as a preparation for fighting and as an expression of anger, erection of the ears and raising the head, a sign of attention. In this and the following chapter I will describe, but only in sufficient detail to illustrate my subject, the expressive movements under different states of the mind of some few well-known animals. But before considering them in due succession, it will save much useless repetition to discuss certain means of expression common to most of them. The emission of sounds. With many kinds of animals, man included, the vocal organs are efficient in the highest degree as a means of expression. We have seen in the last chapter that when the sensorium is strongly excited, the muscles of the body are generally thrown into violent action, and as a consequence, local sounds are uttered, however silent the animal may generally be, and although the sounds may be of no use. Hares and rabbits, for instance, never, I believe, use their vocal organs except in the extremity of suffering, as when a wounded hare is killed by the sportsman, or when a young rabbit is caught by a stoat. Cattle and horses suffer great pain in silence, but when this is excessive, and especially when associated with terror, they utter fearful sounds. I have often recognized from a distance on the pampas the agonized death bellow of the cattle when caught by the lasso and hamstrung. It is said that horses, when attacked by wolves, utter loud and peculiar screams of distress. Involuntary and purposeless contractions of the muscles of the chest and glottis, excited in the above manner, may have first given rise to the emission of vocal sounds. But the voice is now largely used by many animals for various purposes. The habit seems to have played an important part in its employment under circumstances. Naturalists have remarked, I believe with truth, that social animals, from habitually using their vocal organs as a means of intercommunication, use them on other occasions much more freely than other animals. But there are marked exceptions to this rule, for instance with the rabbit. The principle also of association, which is so widely extended in its power, has likewise played its part. Hence it follows that the voice, from having been habitually employed as a serviceable aid under certain conditions, including pleasure, pain, rage, etc., is commonly used whenever the same sensations or emotions are excited under quite different conditions, or in a lesser degree. The sexes of many animals incessantly call to each other during the breeding season, and in not a few cases the male endeavors thus to charm or excite the female. This, indeed, seems to have been the primeval use and means of development of the voice, as I have attempted to show in my Descent of Man. Thus the use of the vocal organs will have become associated with the anticipation of the strongest pleasure which animals are capable of feeling. Animals which live in society often call to each other when separated, and evidently feel much joy at meeting, as we shall see with a horse on the return of his companion, for whom he has been neighing. The mother calls incessantly for her lost young ones, for instance, a cow for her calf, and the young of many animals call for their mothers. When a flock of sheep is scattered, the ewes bleat incessantly for their lambs, and their mutual pleasure at coming together is manifest. Woe betide the man who meddles with the young of the larger and fiercer quadrupeds if they hear the cry of distress from their young. Rage leads to the violent exertion of all the muscles, including those of the voice, and some animals, when enraged, endeavor to strike terror into their enemies by its power and harshness, as the lion does by roaring and the dog by growling. I infer that their object is to strike terror, because the lion at the same time erects the hair of its mane, and the dog the hair along its back, and thus they make themselves appear as large and terrible as possible. Rival males try to excel and challenge each other by their voices, and this leads to deadly contests. Thus, the use of the voice will have become associated with the emotion of anger, however it may be aroused. We have also seen that intense pain, like rage, leads to violent outcries, and the exertion of screaming by itself gives some relief, and thus the use of the voice will have become associated with suffering of any kind. The cause of widely different sounds being uttered under different emotions and sensations is a very obscure subject, nor does the rule always hold good that there is any marked difference. For instance, with the dog, the bark of anger and that of joy do not differ much, though they can be distinguished. It is not probable that any precise explanation of the cause or source of each particular sound under different states of mind will ever be given. We know that some animals, after being domesticated, have acquired the habit of uttering sounds which were not natural to them. Thus, domestic dogs and even tamed jackals have learned to bark, which is a noise not proper to any species of the genus, with the exception of the Canis iotrans of North America, which is said to bark. Some breeds also of the domestic pigeon have learned to coo in a new and quite peculiar manner. The character of the human voice, under the influence of various emotions, has been discussed by Mr. Herbert Spencer in his interesting essay on music. He clearly shows that the voice alters much under different conditions, in loudness and in quality, that is, in resonance and timbre, in pitch and intervals. No one can listen to an eloquent orator or preacher, or to a man calling angrily to another, or to one expressing astonishment, without being struck with the truth of Mr. Spencer's remarks. It is curious how early in life the modulation of the voice becomes expressive. With one of my children, under the age of 2 years, I clearly perceived that his humph of assent was rendered by a slight modulation strongly emphatic, and that by a peculiar whine his negative expressed obstinate determination. Mr. Spencer further shows that emotional speech, in all the above respects, is intimately related to vocal music, and consequently to instrumental music, and he attempts to explain the characteristic qualities of both on physiological grounds, namely, "on the general law that a feeling is a stimulus to muscular action." It may be admitted that the voice is affected through this law, but the explanation appears to me too general and vague to throw much light on the various differences, with the exception of that loudness being ordinary speech and emotional speech, or singing. This remark holds good whether we believe that the various qualities of the voice originated in speaking under the excitement of strong feelings, and that these qualities have subsequently been transferred to vocal music, or whether we believe, as I maintain, that the habit of uttering musical sounds was first developed as a means of courtship in the early progenitors of man, and thus became associated with the strongest emotions of which they were capable, namely, ardent love, rivalry, and triumph. That animals utter musical notes is familiar to everyone, as we may daily hear in the singing of birds. It is a more remarkable fact that an ape, one of the gibbons, produces an exact octave of musical sounds, ascending and descending the scale by half tones, so that this monkey alone of brute mammals may be said to sing. From this fact, and from the analogy of other animals, I have been led to infer that the progenitors of man probably uttered musical tones before they acquired the power of articulate speech, and that consequently, when the voice is used under any strong emotion, it tends to assume, through the principle of association, a musical character. We can plainly perceive, with some of the lower animals, that the males employ their voices to please the females, and that they themselves take pleasure in their own vocal utterances. But why particular sounds are uttered, and why these give pleasure, cannot at present be explained. That the pitch of the voice bears some relation to certain states of feeling is tolerably clear. A person gently complaining of ill treatment, or slightly suffering, almost always speaks in a high-pitched voice. Dogs, when a little impatient, often make a high piping note through their noses, which at once strike us as plaintive. But how difficult it is to know whether the sound is essentially plaintive, or only appears so in this particular case, from our having learnt by experience what it means. Ringer states that the monkeys, Cebus azaro, which he kept in Paraguay, expressed astonishment by a half-piping, half-snarling noise, anger or impatience by repeating the sound hoo, hoo, in a deeper grunting voice, and fright or pain by shrill screams. On the other hand, with mankind, deep groans and high piercing screams equally express an agony of pain. Laughter may be either high or low, so that with adult men, as Haller long ago remarked, the sound partakes of the character of the vowels, as pronounced in German, o and a, whilst the children and women it has more character of e and I. And these latter vowel sounds naturally have, as Helmholtz has shown, a higher pitch than the former, yet both tones of laughter equally express enjoyment or amusement. In considering the mode in which vocal utterances express emotion, we are naturally led to inquire into the cause of what is called expression in music. Upon this point, Mr. Litchfield, who has long attended to the subject of music, has been so kind as to give me the following remarks. Quote, "The question, what is the essence of musical expression, involves a number of obscure points, which, so far as I am aware, are as yet unresolved enigmas. Up to a certain point, however, any law which is found to hold as to the expression of the emotions by simple sounds must apply to the more developed mode of expression in song, which may be taken as the primary type of all music. A great part of the emotional effect of a song depends on the character of the action by which the sounds are produced. In songs, for instance, which express great vehemence of passion, the effect often chiefly depends on the forcible utterance of some one or two characteristic passages which demand great exertion of vocal force, and it will be frequently noticed that a song of this character fails of its proper effect when sung by a voice of sufficient power and range to give the characteristic passages without much exertion. This is, no doubt, the secret of the loss of effect so often produced by the transposition of a song from one key to another. The effect is thus seen to depend not merely on the actual sounds, but also in part on the nature of the action which produces the sounds. Indeed, it is obvious that whenever we feel the expression of a song to be due to its quickness or slowness of movement, to smoothness of flow, loudness of utterance, and so on, we are, in fact, interpreting the muscular actions which produce sound, in the same way in which we interpret muscular action generally. But this leaves unexplained the more subtle and more specific effect which we call the musical expression of the song, the delight given by its melody, or even by the separate sounds which make up the melody. This is an effect indefinable in language, one which, so far as I am aware, no one has been able to analyze, and which the ingenious speculation of Mr. Herbert Spencer as to the origin of music leaves quite unexplained. For it is certain that a melodic effect of a series of sounds does not depend in the least on their loudness or softness, or on their absolute pitch. A tune is always the same tune, whether it is sung loudly or softly, by a child or a man, whether it is played on a flute or on a trombone. The purely musical effect of any sound depends on its place in what is technically called a scale, the same sound producing absolutely different effects on the ear according as it is heard in connection with one or another series of sounds. It is on this relative association of the sounds that all the essentially characteristic effects which are summed up in the phrase musical expression depend. But why certain associations of sounds have such and such effects is a problem which yet remains to be solved. These effects must indeed, in some way or other, be connected with the well-known arithmetical relations between the rates of vibration of the sounds which form the musical scale. And it is possible, but this is merely a suggestion, that the greater or less mechanical facility with which the vibrating apparatus of the human larynx passes from one state of vibration to another may have been a primary cause of the greater or lesser pleasure produced by various sequences of sounds. But leaving aside these complex questions and confining ourselves to the simpler sounds, we can at least see some reasons for the association of certain kinds of sounds with certain states of mind. A scream, for instance, uttered by a young animal or by one of the members of a community as a call for assistance, will naturally be loud, prolonged, and high, so as to penetrate to a distance. For Helmholtz has shown that, owing to the shape of the internal cavity of the human ear and its consequent power of resonance, high notes produce a particularly strong impression. When male animals utter sounds in order to please the females, they would naturally employ those which are sweet to the ears of the species, and it appears that the same sounds are often pleasing to widely different animals, owing to the similarity of their nervous systems, as we ourselves perceive in the singing of birds, and even in the chirping of certain tree frogs giving us pleasure. On the other hand, sounds produced in order to strike terror into an enemy would naturally be harsh or displeasing. Whether the principle of antithesis has come into play with sounds, as might perhaps have been expected, is doubtful. The interrupted, laughing, or tittering sounds made by man and by various kinds of monkeys when pleased are as different as possible from the prolonged screams of these animals when distressed. The deep grunt of satisfaction uttered by a pig when pleased with its food is widely different from its harsh scream of pain or terror. But with the dog, as lately remarked, the bark of anger and that of joy are sounds which by no means stand in opposition to each other, and so it is in some other cases. There is another obscure point, namely, whether the sounds which are produced under various states of the mind determine the shape of the mouth, or whether its shape is not determined by independent causes, and the sound thus modified. When young infants cry, they open their mouths widely, and this, no doubt, is necessary for pouring forth a full volume of sound, but the mouth then assumes, from a quite distinct cause, an almost quadrilateral shape, depending, as will hereafter be explained, on the firm closing of the eyelids and consequent drawing up of the upper lip. How far this square shape of the mouth modifies the wailing or crying sound, I am not prepared to say, but we know from the researches of Helmholtz and others that the form of the cavity of the mouth and lips determines the nature and pitch of the vowel sounds which are produced. It will also be shown in a future chapter that, under the feeling of contempt or disgust, there is a tendency, from intelligible causes, to blow out of the mouth or nostrils, and this produces sounds like pooh or pish. When anyone is startled or suddenly astonished, there is an instantaneous tendency, likewise from an intelligible cause, namely, to be ready for prolonged exertion, to open the mouth widely so as to draw a deep and rapid inspiration. When the next full expiration follows, the mouth is slightly closed, and the lips, from causes hereafter to be discussed, are somewhat protruded, and this form of the mouth, if the voice be at all exerted, produces, according to Helmholtz, the sound of the vowel O. Certainly a deep sound of the prolonged O may be heard from a whole crowd of people immediately after witnessing any astonishing spectacle. If, together with surprise, pain be felt, there is a tendency to contract all the muscles of the body, including those of the face, and the lips will then be drawn back, and this will perhaps account for the sound becoming higher and assuming the character of ah or ach. As fear causes all the muscles of the body to tremble, the voice naturally becomes tremulous, and at the same time husky from the dryness of the mouth, owing to the salivary glands failing to act. Why the laughter of man and the tittering of monkeys should be a rapidly reiterated sound cannot be explained. During the utterance of these sounds, the mouth is transversely elongated by the corners being drawn backwards and upwards, and of this fact an explanation will be attempted in a future chapter. But the whole subject of the differences of the sounds produced under different states of mind is so obscure that I have succeeded in throwing hardly any light on it, and the remarks which I have made have but little significance. All the sounds hitherto noticed depend on the respiratory organs, but sounds produced by wholly different means are likewise expressive. Rabbits stamp loudly on the ground as a signal to their comrades, and if a man knows how to do so properly, he may on a quiet evening hear the rabbits answering him all around. These animals, as well as some others, also stamp on the ground when made angry. Porcupines rattle their quills and vibrate their tails when angered, and one behaved in this manner when a live snake was placed in its compartment. The quills on the tail are very different from those on the body. They are short, hollow, thin like a goose quill, with their ends transversely truncated, so that they are open. They are supported on long, thin, elastic footstalks. Now, when the tail is rapidly shaken, these hollow quills strike against each other and produce, as I heard in the presence of Mr. Bartlett, a peculiar continuous sound. We can, I think, understand why porcupines have been provided, through the modification of their protective spines, with this special sound-producing instrument. They are nocturnal animals, and if they scented or heard a prowling beast of prey, it would be a great advantage to them in the dark to give warning to their enemy what they were, and that they were furnished with dangerous spines. They would thus escape being attacked. They are, as I may add, so fully conscious of the power of their weapons that when they are enraged they will charge backwards with their spines erected, yet still inclined backwards. Many birds during their courtship produce diversified sounds by means of specially adapted feathers. Storks, when excited, make a loud clattering noise with their beaks. Some snakes produce a grating or rattling noise. Many insects stridulate by rubbing together specifically modified parts of their hard integuments. This stridulation generally serves as a sexual charm or call, but it is likewise used to express different emotions. Everyone who has attended to bees knows that their humming changes when they are angry, and this serves as a warning that there is danger of being stung. I have made these few remarks because some writers have laid so much stress on the vocal and respiratory organs as having been specially adapted for expression that it was advisable to show that sounds otherwise produced serve equally well for the same purpose. Erection of the dermal appendages. Hardly any expressive movement is so general as the involuntary erection of the hairs, feathers, or other dermal appendages, for it is common throughout 3 of the great vertebrate classes. These appendages are erected under the excitement of anger or terror, more especially when these emotions are combined or quickly succeed each other. The action serves to make the animal appear larger and more frightful to its enemies or rivals, and is generally accompanied by various voluntary movements adapted for the same purpose, and by the utterance of savage sounds. Mr. Bartlett, who has had such wide experience with animals of all kinds, does not doubt that this is the case, but it is a different question whether the power of erection was primarily acquired for this special purpose. I will first give a considerable body of facts showing how general this action is with mammals, birds, and reptiles, retaining what I have to say in regard to man for a future chapter. Mr. Sutton, the intelligent keeper in the zoological gardens, carefully observed for me the chimpanzee and orang, and he states that when they are suddenly frightened, as by a thunderstorm, or when they are made angry, as by being teased, their hair becomes erect. I saw a chimpanzee who was alarmed at the sight of a black coal heaver, and the hair rose all over his body. He made little starts forward as if to attack the man, without any real intention of doing so, but with the hope, as the keeper remarked, of frightening him. The gorilla, when enraged, is described by Mr. Ford as having his crest of hair, quote, erect and projecting forward, his nostrils dilated, and his underlip thrown down, at the same time uttering his characteristic yell, designed, it would seem, to terrify his antagonists, end quote. I saw the hair on the Anubis baboon, when angered, bristling along the back, from the neck to the loins, but not on the rump or other parts of the body. I took a stuffed snake into the monkey house, and the hair on several of the species instantly became erect, especially on their tails, as I particularly noted with the Cereopithecus nictitans. Brehm states that the Midas oedipus, belonging to the American division, when excited erects its mane, in order, as he adds, to make itself as frightful as possible. With the carnivora, the erection of the hair seems to be almost universal, often accompanied by threatening movements, the uncovering of the teeth, and the utterance of savage growls. In the Herpestes, I have seen the hair on end over nearly the whole body, including the tail, and the dorsal crest is erected in a conspicuous manner by the hyena and the protellus. The enraged lion erects his mane. The bristling of the hair along the neck and back of the dog and over the whole body of the cat, especially on the tail, is familiar to everyone. With the cat, it apparently occurs only under fear, with the dog under anger and fear, but not, as far as I have observed, under abject fear, as when the dog is going to be flogged by a severe gamekeeper. If, however, the dog shows fight, as sometimes happens, up goes his hair. I have often noticed that the hair of a dog is particularly liable to rise if he is half angry and half afraid, as on beholding some object only indistinctly seen in the dusk. I have been assured by a veterinary surgeon that he has often seen the hair erected on horses and cattle on which he had operated and was again going to operate. When I showed the stuffed snake to the peccary, the hair rose in a wonderful manner along its back, and so it does with the boar when enraged. An elk which gored a man to death in the United States is described as first brandishing his antlers, squealing with rage, and stamping on the ground. At length his hair was seen to rise and stand on end, and then he plunged forward to the attack. The hair likewise becomes erect on goats, and as I hear from Mr. Blythe, on some Indian antelopes. I have seen it erected on the hairy anteater and on the agouti, one of the rodents. A female bat, which reared her young under confinement, when anyone looked into the cage, erected the fur on her back and bit viciously at intruding fingers. Birds belonging to all the chief orders ruffle their feathers when angry or frightened. Everyone must have seen two cocks, even quite young birds, preparing to fight with erected neck hackles, nor can these feathers when erected serve as a means of defense, for cockfighters have found by experience that it is advantageous to trim them. The male ruff, Machetes pugnax, likewise erects its collar of feathers when fighting. When a dog approaches a common hen with her chickens, she spreads out her wings, raises her tail, ruffles all her feathers, and looking as ferocious as possible, dashes at the intruder. The tail is not always held in exactly the same position. It is sometimes so much erected that the central feathers, as in the accompanying drawing, almost touch the back. Swans, when angered, likewise raise their wings and tail and erect their feathers. They open their beaks and make, by paddling little rapid starts forwards, against anyone who approaches the water's edge too closely. Tropic birds, when disturbed on their nests, are said not to fly away, but, merely to stick out their feathers and scream. The barn owl, when approached, instantly swells out its plumage, extends its wings and tail, hisses and clacks its mandibles with force and rapidity. So do other kinds of owls. Hawks, as I am informed by Mr. Jenner Weir, likewise ruffle their feathers and spread out their wings and tail under similar circumstances. Some kinds of parrots erect their feathers, and I have seen this action in the cassowary when angered at the sight of an anteater. Young cuckoos in the nest raise their feathers, open their mouths widely, and make themselves as frightful as possible. Small birds also, as I hear from Mr. Weir, such as various finches, buntings, and warblers, when angry, ruffle all their feathers, or only those around the neck, or they spread out their wings and tail feathers. With the plumage in this state, they rush at each other with open beaks and threatening gestures. Mr. Weir concludes from his large experience that the erection of the feathers is caused much more by anger than by fear. He gives as an instance a hybrid goldfinch of a most irascible disposition, which, when approached too closely by a servant, instantly assumes the appearance of a ball of ruffled feathers. He believes that birds, when frightened, as a general rule, closely adpress all their feathers, and their consequently diminished size is often astonishing. As soon as they recover from their fear or surprise, the first thing which they do is shake out their feathers. The best instances of this adpression of the feathers and apparent shrinking of the body from fear, which Mr. Weir has noticed, has been in the quail and grass parakeet. The habit is intelligible in these birds from their being accustomed, when in danger, either to squat on the ground or to sit motionless on a branch so as to escape detection. Though with birds anger may be the chief and commonest cause of the erection of the feathers, it is probable that young cuckoos, when looked at in the nest, and a hen with her chickens when approached by a dog, feel at least some terror. Mr. Tegetmeier informs me that with gamecocks the erection of the feathers on the head has long been recognized in the cockpit as a sign of cowardice. The males of some lizards, when fighting together during their courtship, expand their throat pouches or frills and erect their dorsal crests. But Dr. Gunther does not believe that they can erect their separate spines or scales. End of section 7.